Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the expectant hush. Shh. For those of you who aren't expectantly hushing, shh. Good morning, everybody. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm the Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy of the American Enterprise Institute. I'm really delighted to open this important event on reforming emergency food aid assistance, which will also be rolling out this extremely important report that I commend to all of you. And to kick things off, I'd like to welcome a very good friend, Senator Bob Corker, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was not recently, but he was elected overwhelmingly to a second term representing the state of Tennessee. And he's really been a, if I may use the expression, fearless leader on the rather challenging question of reforming food aid assistance. He's been at the forefront of the movement, and he really is an advocate for using limited foreign aid dollars more efficiently to advance U.S. interests and to help the overwhelming needs that we face overseas. There are a record number of refugees and displaced people in the world today, and the need for continued U.S. involvement and food aid leadership really is stronger than ever. I'm going to kick things over to the two gentlemen seated here, and thank you very much, Senator, for being here. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm Vince Smith, and I direct the Agricultural Studies program at AEI, and it's my privilege to interview Senator Corker today on the crucial issues of improving the efficiency of U.S. food aid programs. Senator, let me begin with my first question.
Okay.
U.S. emergency food aid programs are a lifeline for millions of desperately poor people in dire need around the world. Given current funding levels, what reforms are needed to make those programs work more effectively and serve more women, children, and men around the globe?
So I'll answer the question. I first want to thank AEI for doing this. I find that many think tanks here in our community actually are destructive in that the perfect is always the enemy of the good. And we have scholars in these think tanks who are constantly undermining efforts that when two sides get together, it's always not perfect, it's good. In this particular case, AEI has done an outstanding job, and I really appreciate it heralding this. I appreciate Danny's work for many, many years. But AEI is also in looking at these types of reforms. And to answer your question, there are two things that we can do. First of all, most American farmers don't realize that, unfortunately, the ag bills stipulate that we have to use U.S. commodities in so many cases where needs exist around the world, and it takes 4 to 6 months in many cases when we have and right now we have so many man-made crises that are creating starvation and misery. But we are forced to use ag commodities in places where that's just inappropriate. As a matter of fact, the amount of the effect that it has on the agriculture community is incredibly small. 0.1% of the commodity program that we use to feed starving people around the world, 0.1% is the amount of U.S. output, ag output. So it has almost no effect, if you will, on the ag community. 0.4 of the amount of exports in general that our ag community exports is part of this program. But the interest here on the Hill force us to use U.S. commodities when that is totally inappropriate in so many cases. The other piece is we have to flag it on U.S. ships. This is an old sort of a hangover, if you will, when it was felt that if we were ever in a war, we would need these ships, if you will, to actually help us gear up and to get military equipment around the world. But that makes the cost of it incredibly expensive. And what we found is there's 2 New York-based companies that benefit from this. And what the effect of this, first of all, the commodities program, having to use ag commodities, we need to use some, and there are cases when it's very beneficial, but how do you get U.S. ag commodities to a place like Syria, for instance? I was in Uganda not long ago, and it had taken 6 months literally, to get food to a place that we could have easily, just with cash assistance, dealt with people there. So those are the two things. We could feed 9.5 million more people in the world each year if we would just do away with these two components and not spend one more dime. 40,000 babies die each year unnecessarily because of this program and the way that it's set up, where, again, if we would just free up these two components, our nation, with the same amount of dollars, could serve so many more people. It's common sense. Again, when I tell the people back home that are part of the ag community, I met with actually one of the national leaders, they had no idea the negative impact that was taking place. I'm certain that farmers in Tennessee that are good people, these are people that, you know, typically, I mean, you hate to use generalizations in the world today, but these are people who raise families or part of their communities. They have no idea that interest here in Washington that quote, 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 are representing them are causing people around the world to starve over forcing U.S. commodities to be used in places where it's totally unnecessary. If you meet with the ag staffers, I'm sorry, it's like talking to a brick wall. They're going to protect, quote, this constituency that, I'm sorry, doesn't even want to be protected. So anyway, sorry for the long answer.
No, this is important. I think you're exactly right. The National Farmers Union president not long ago said this is one of the major issues on which the farm group needs to understand the need for change.
Right. Good.
Beyond providing humanitarian aid, which is vitally needed around the world, do U.S. food programs also serve U.S. foreign relations interests in several different ways, and if so, in what ways?
Well, I mean, a great example, our policy towards Europe for 70 years is that it would be whole, democratic, and free. And we want Europe, for instance, to be stable. You know, it's important to us that these Western nations that have been our allies for so many years are stable. When you have food insecurity, there's tremendous amounts of migration that takes place as people seek other places to be. Mass migration, which we've seen recently in some of the conflicts that are taking place in the Middle East, creates instability in these areas. It creates unrest among the citizenry that exists there. So it's definitely in U.S. national interest for that to occur. In addition to that, in places that, you know, like I just mentioned, South Sudan, people migrating into Uganda and other places, again, creates instability in these camps, which are just incredible. Thank those many of you who are in this room who provide aid to people in need. It's unbelievably gut-wrenching to see what people go through, but heartwarming to see what your groups do to help these folks. But in these camps, when people don't have the needs that they have, it creates extremism. It breeds violent acts. And so, yes, it's definitely in our U.S. national interest. And again, when you look at the amount of money we're talking about, the small amount of money that we're talking about in these little changes that I'm talking about here would greatly benefit our nation.
Well, let me ask you a question about the amount of aid. The point that you're making is that we need to use aid more efficiently and more effectively, and we can help millions of additional people in doing that.
Yeah.
Is the amount of aid adequate to the needs that we're currently providing out of the United States?
Well, look, we're in a constrained situation. Our nation has $20 trillion in debt, and it's going to grow substantially. We're going to be back to $1 trillion a year deficits in the very, very near future. We are in a lack of, we're at a moment in time where I see that, I've been here 10 years and 9 months. We're at a moment in time where I see the least discipline in what we're doing that I've seen since I've been here. It's like it's party time. I don't know what's happened since since the election in November. But look, there's pulls in many, many directions. I think you know that mandatory spending makes up 70% of what we spend. Our nation and many Western countries are not willing to deal with that issue, that 70% of our money goes out the door with any appropriation. So we are obviously the largest provider of aid in the world, and it's because of the large GDP that we have relative to the world. Look, that's a qualitative assessment. We are a very generous nation. Let me just say, unless we generate the disciplines within our own country that we need, first of all, we're our greatest threat to ourselves. We are our greatest threat to ourselves and our inability. A lot of young people in the room. Typically, a forum like this attracts young people. But the greatest threat to you and your life and your freedom is us, our inability to control our finances, to deal with fiscal issues in an appropriate way. It will be our downfall. It will cause us to be less generous around the world because we won't have the resources to do so. So, look, what I'd like to see us provide more aid to people in need, of course. One of the things we can do as a nation, I think, to benefit the world is to be counted upon for what aid we say we're going to commit, but also to help try to spur other nations to mimic and to follow our lead.
Beyond the agricultural lobby, the mercantile, marine, private shipping companies have some arguments to justify their position on cargo preference, that it in fact should be expanded. Is there any valid validity to the argument that food aid cargo preference helps us enhance our capabilities in our defense mission?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's the word hoax is used a lot up here now, as it should be, I will say.
Is that a fake hoax?
Well, you know, yeah. That is a major hoax. As I mentioned, I think there are 24 to 40 ships that are used for this type of effort. Only one is capable. One. There are 5 ships that these 2 New York companies own. I just asked Trey. I'd love to know who owns these companies. You can tell me later. I might make a call to them. But there's only one ship of all of these that could be possibly used, maybe 200 to 300 mariners. But there are 54,000 civilians that are available for this type of effort. So it's a total hoax. As a matter of fact, the Navy was in recently telling us just with their reserves, they could easily handle any kind of uplift. So, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, national security interests always trump humanitarian efforts, right? I mean, they do. And so people always hang, and I'm a strong supporter of national security, don't get me wrong, very strong. But people hang their hat on this national security issue, which doesn't exist. It's a total hoax. And we spend, I think on just the labor component, 5 to 7 times what we should be spending because of these unbelievably expensive arrangements that the unions have created to protect a few people that, again, keep 9.5 million people around the world from being fed. So
it's a shocking situation.
it is.
I had 8 questions for you. You've answered 7 of them.
Thank
and
you.
I've only asked 3.
Yeah.
Let me.
We got work to do.
Well, I know. But one issue that you haven't talked about is monetization. The practice of giving NGOs food from the United States, which they then ship and sell in a country of interest, and use the money to support longer-term programs to enhance agriculture in those countries.
So, I think that our new USAID person who's come in that I think most people are glad is there. His new mandate is to say that we should provide aid in a manner that over time means we won't have to provide aid in the future, meaning that our whole goal is to make other countries self-sufficient, to help them move along and to be able to deal with their own issues. So think about this, again, over this ridiculous commodity program that's in the ag title. NGOs, some of you are part of this, and other organizations that are trying to help people around the world, because we're forced to, again, ship on expensive ships 4 to 6 months overseas, having nothing whatsoever to do with their national security, just because there's a lobby here that makes this happen. These goods end up in people's hands, these NGOs, and so what do they do in the local markets? Again, well-meaning NGOs, I'm not knocking in, they sell it at a discount in the local market. Now, how stupid is that? So you have farmers there. We're trying to develop these countries' ability to serve their own citizens, to provide over the longer term their own ability. We're helping people learn, how to do agriculture in a better way, and then we ship in our own commodities and undermine their pricing and put them out of business. I mean, how stupid. And we do that again because of an ag title to protect U.S. farmers where they don't even want to be protected. So, look, there are some limited cases where monetization, I understand, makes sense, some limited cases, and we should have some degree of flexibility for that. But look, we rail here in our own country about China dumping steel or something and putting people out of work here, and yet as a part of our efforts to help other people, we knowingly undermine the efforts of other countries and local farmers who, again, are trying to learn new methods to help feed their own population. It's just absolute stupidity. But other than that, it's a good thing for us to be doing. Yeah.
And I thought I was a sarcastic economist.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes for questions for the senator. Please, if you ask a question, if you would, rather than make a statement. And please give us your name and your affiliation. Lady over here.
Thank you very much for your
We have a mic for you.
My name is Jerry Hush, and I'm a consultant with the UN system, so I deal with global governance and the food system. And I actually want to pick up on your last statement. One of the things I've learned upon my return to Washington is that we tend to have bilateral agreements. So your comments were about undermining national engagement. I'm very interested in multilateral agreements. Is there a way that the U.S. could support FAO, support the UN system, so that instead of going in with USAID or going in with bilateral agreements on agriculture, we could have a far more integrated set of policies?
I should have added, focus on food aid specifically, please.
Oh, this is food aid.
I know.
This is food aid.
Well, but we do support the World Food Program, right?
Yes, you do.
So
we do.
yeah.
I'm sorry. We
yeah,
do.
yeah. So I hear you, and I don't know exactly how to answer that question. I mean, the United States in general, both sides of the aisle, more so my side of the aisle, but both sides of the aisle have concerns about the efficacy of the UN, and you know that. I agree with the assessment. If the UN didn't exist, we'd want to create something like it, but you do walk in the building, and I'm sorry, your blood pressure drops tremendously because of just the feeling of not much happening. I'm sorry. But it's an important institution, and I think that I have a bill that we just introduced with Chris Coons, a wonderful friend of mine on the other side of the aisle, to really assess some of the efforts that are underway at the UN, and a goal not to undermine, but to really sort of build, for us to be able to assess what's happening in there and to support the good things that are occurring. But I guess I would say we do support, we do bilateral, but we also are we're the largest contributor to the United Nations. 25 to 28% of the budget comes from the United States. I'm not a tear down kind of person. I'm a person, let's analyze and make it better kind of person. But there is a lot of work at the UN that needs to be done to encourage increased support, if you will, within our own country for what's happening there. I support it, but I'd like for it to be much more efficacious in what it does.
You had a question here? Again, please give us your name, your affiliation, and then your question.
Okay, Senator Corker, thank you very much for your remarks and for your concern about people in the world. My name is Dimitri. I have it's unforpeace.org, and she kind of stole my question. My question was about the United Nations, but I would like to see it become more effective. And as you said, because conflict drives a lot of the food aid issues around the world, so I think it would be possible to make the United Nations more effective, and I applaud you for trying to do so as a chairman on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And my roommate asked him what should be a question this morning, and since my question was already asked, I'll use his, which I thought was actually an interesting one. Should there be a competency test for the United States president?
Oh, no, we're not going to go there right now.
Well, I'm glad to go there.
But, Senator, this is food aid.
Thank your roommate for his question. I understand his sentiments, or her sentiments. Okay.
I think we've got time for one more question. Over here.
West Knowles Meridian International Center. I guess the question is, I was reading about a program in Western Kenya that is proposing a universal basic income where cash transfers are made to needy communities via mobile phone. So my question is, could we not just sort of dodge this entire ag commodities problem, which I've heard a lot about, and give money directly to needy communities, avoid NGO selling at a market, not drive farmers out?
Yeah.
They can put money away for education, they can put money away for healthcare. It seems like, a perfect opportunity to try something that's bold and fresh and new that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I think one of the recommendations in this report, if I've read so much this morning, I don't know whether it's in the AEI report or whether it's in the testimony we're going to have later today on the same topic. It's in both, but certainly that is a commonsensical thing that needs to occur. In some cases, there is a lack of commodities there, and so in those cases we need to make those available. But a much more efficient way of dealing with it is just like you mentioned. You do away with a lot of the corruption that can take place in between it leaving here and getting there, and you can help build markets. So that should be a big part of what we do. And what's happening in many countries around the world, as you know, because they've been so underdeveloped, they're able to skip a couple of generations of technology and how they do things. It's really fascinating, isn't it? So anyway, great point, and that's an essential part of this report and what we're going to hear in testimony later today in the Foreign Relations Committee.
Oh, we do have time for at least one more question, possibly two. So the lady.
Thank you very much. Sophie Edwards with Devex. A few months ago, there was a story in Reuters about the president potentially having an executive order to increase the volume of food aid that had to go through the shipping. And I understand that you were instrumental in stopping that happening. I just would love to get an insight in how that worked and what you said and what you did. And thank you as well for doing it.
Yeah, thank you. The White House is, especially this one, made up of a real cast of characters, if you will. And
Senator, do you
so you have to you have to time your interdictions at the appropriate time. Unfortunately, and I've learned even more since that interdiction took place, it's unfortunate that I guess maybe I better look. A White House is made up of a large number of people, and especially in this particular arrangement and just the type of campaign that took place, there are people that have a lot of nativist instincts that exist there that are contrary to some more proven norms. Let me put it that way. And so I just I made a phone call to the president directly. Don't get me wrong, this is not over. Okay, it stopped it at that moment, but these forces within will continue, and so we've got to continue to use reason. There are actually, unfortunately, cabinet secretaries that represent interest, and just from a political standpoint, to make, unfortunately, a small group of people happy who might have supported the president, which is, again, unfortunate. They're going to continue to push this type of activity. So, again, it's stopped currently, but it's not something that, it's going to continue on, and we've got to do everything we can to keep that from raising its head again.
We've got time for
But the president, and to his credit, got it. I mean, he understood. I mean, the base case, I'm sorry, I don't know how anybody could disagree with the base case. And in this particular case, he got it, and I appreciated that very much.
We have time for one last short question. The lady way at the back.
Hi, I'm Molly Rossi from USAID, the Office of Food for Peace. I'm also a proud Tennessean.
Oh, good.
So thank you, Senator Corker.
Thank you.
My question, I think you make a really good point about how farmers in Tennessee and Kansas and Iowa wouldn't want us to be price gouging people that we're trying to save.
Yeah.
And wouldn't want us to be inefficient in that way because it hurts them as taxpayers too, right? Not even just as agricultural. So what's the best way to educate domestically the agricultural community, the farming community? How do we educate those people and share this knowledge so that they know?
Yeah, it really, it really is a group at a time. I sat down and had dinner with the leader of the American Farm Bureau system, and first of all, I'd given a talk in Tennessee at the annual Tennessee Farm Bureau Association meeting, and I think people were truly stunned at what was happening. Really, 0.1%? Not 1%, 0.1% of the entire ag output is what we're talking about here. And what you have is some ag staffers. Look, this is territory. Do you understand? It's my territory, man. I'm not giving up my territory. This is my clout within the Senate, and so they don't understand what's happening in that regard. And when they do, they're stunned. And so, I had dinner recently, as recently 4 months ago or so, with the American Farm. He didn't even know it. Was unaware, and he too was shocked. But I think it's really a state at a time. I think it's just making people aware and causing those Farm Bureau presidents and others to say, hey, this we don't want this kind of protection. Okay, this is not something that really helps us in any meaningful way. But to hurt 9.5 million people around the world and to keep them from having adequate nutrition, this is an inappropriate thing to take place. I think we're going to be successful, but okay, the base case is just too strong.
Senator, thank you so much for coming, spending time with us. We really appreciate your remarks and your thoughts. and congratulate you on the bipartisan effort that you lead.
Let me say one thing. I'm leaving here, as you know, in 14 and a half months. It's been the greatest privilege of my life. But one of the great privileges is working with people who are so committed to making good things happen for our country. And much of that resides in our staff, some of the finest, most committed people I've ever been around in my life, and Trey Hicks is one of those. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And everything you're doing, Senator. I'm so glad we're doing something for it.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to a discussion of the report that the Senator just talked about. We're going to take a moment or two to set up the podium, and then we're going to launch into the work by Chris Barrett, Stephanie Mercier, and Aaron Lentz, and it'll just be a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Save the Children. I just want to thank you so much for including us.
Oh, no, it's fabulous. Thank you.
Terrific opening.
Oh. I had these 8 questions. He hit every one of them in about 2 minutes.
Well, you can't beat champions like that.
No.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And have you met Brian Hunter?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good morning.
I went fabulously.
That's the fifth
Yes.
this morning. That simplifies my job later this morning.
Well, the we want to move along quickly into the next part of the program. Chris Barrett has to be floated up to the hill to give testimony on food aid at 10 o'clock sharp. And so we're going to get ourselves underway. Hopefully you've all got coffee, donuts, or pastries. It really is a pleasure to welcome all of you to AI. This is an issue, food aid reform, that everyone on the stage deeply cares about. So much of what we see with food aid is crony capitalism in terms of maintaining antediluvian, outdated policies. I speak as an economist, not that I have an opinion, but we're thrilled to have Chris Barrett, who is professor at Cornell University and occasionally an administrator there, for which he apologizes, who is internationally the leading researcher on food aid issues. Stephanie Mercier, who served for 10 years as the chief economist to the Senate Agricultural Committee, and we're privileged to have her with us. And Brian Hunter, who is the associate vice president at Save the Children. Brian has had both experience in Washington in the last year and a half, for which we have deep sympathy for you, and in addition has worked with food aid programs in the field during his extended career, dealing with populations in poverty and populations facing hunger. So it's my pleasure to introduce them to you all. Stephanie Mercier is going to begin the presentation of the findings in the new paper that we're issuing today on food aid, and you have copies of it on the tables. Stephanie, over to you.
All right. So I'd like to point out that Erin Lentz is a co-author with Chris and I in this paper. She was not able to be here, but she is actually the lead author in the paper. And the work was more or less shared equally between the three of us. Topic of the paper is international food aid and food assistance and the upcoming Farm Bill. U.S. has always been a major player in international humanitarian assistance. Food aid is one response to the growing crises overseas, but unfortunately this is an increasingly scarce resource. U.S. government expenditures on food aid have fallen in real terms by 76% over the last 50 years. And so that means there's far less actual commodities being used in these programs. There's an estimated 815 million undernourished people in the world, and that population is growing. This year, the statistic announced was the first time in 10 years that the number of food insecure people around the world is increasing rather than decreasing. So that's obviously a disturbing trend or disturbing development. There are record numbers of emergencies and a resulting record number of people who are either refugees or displaced persons. Highest number, I think, since the end of the Second World War. So that's part of this very complex crisis that we face. The U.S. is the largest donor of food aid, so what we do on the policy front is very important to this. Typically, traditionally, the United States has been the largest donor, donating roughly 40% of all the humanitarian assistance of the world. And as we've seen these numbers of crises proliferate around the world, the U.S. focus on delivering food aid has shifted from emergencies away from sort of the beginnings of the program, which were focused on surplus disposal and trying to build markets. But frankly, the rules that govern these programs have not kept up with the changing focus of the programs, and that's the resulting inefficiencies that we're going to talk about in this paper. Recent farm bills, and I worked on a couple of these when I was on the Agriculture Committee, plus other legislation, we have made modest improvements in relaxing some of these provisions, including increased opportunity to use cash, vouchers, and local and regional procurement in these countries. And indeed also increased use of cash, as was mentioned by one of the questioners to Senator Corker. We have reduced use of open market monetization in the Untitled Chapter program. It's still the main instrument for programming under the Food for Progress program the USDA runs. And the cargo preference requirement was reduced from 75 to 50% 5 years ago. So that is a reform as well. The human consequences of these restrictions are still substantial. Annually, the human cost of disasters is 42 million life years. What that means is if a 5-year-old dies in an earthquake or a flood, and the average life expectancy of that child would have been 65 in that country, then that's 60 years, life years lost as a result of that catastrophe. So most of these losses are occurring in low and middle income countries, and their number is growing. A paper that Chris and Alex Nikolkov wrote estimates that eliminating both cargo preference and the U.S. sourcing requirements in the U.S. could have reduced child mortality in northern Kenya by at least 16% during recent drought episodes. So that's a substantial room for improvement there. Three statutory restrictions continue to waste taxpayer money, and these come at a very high human cost. Cargo preference rules that inflate shipping costs and delay deliveries to some extent. Limited access to cash-based food assistance program, that's really the monetization process that was mentioned earlier. And then finally, the sourcing requirement that requires that U.S. commodities be purchased in the United States are these three main constraints. I want to talk about cargo preference and then hand over to Chris to discuss the other two requirements. Cargo preference essentially means that under U.S. law, 50% of all U.S. food aid must be carried on what are called U.S. flag vessels to their overseas destinations. U.S. flag vessels are more expensive. In fact, based on information provided by the shippers themselves, the Department of Transportation estimated that the daily operating costs of U.S. flag ships are 270% higher than their foreign counterparts. So obviously there's a big cost component here. The goal of this law is to ensure that U.S. flag vessels owners stay in business in order that their ships and trained crews are available to carry U.S. military cargo in the event of an extended military engagement overseas. Food aid cargo preference requirement has been shown by a number of studies, including work that Vince, Chris, and I have done separately from this report, shows it's both ineffective and very costly. what is the evidence? What does the research show? That U.S. flag ships are older, smaller, and slower than their foreign competitors. Right now, U.S. flag ships carry only 1% of all U.S. foreign trade. That's a decline from, I think, 25% 50 years ago. So they simply cannot compete on a fair basis internationally. Vessels controlled by a number of foreign shipping companies account for a large share of all food aid carried by U.S. flag ships. So what happens is the largest one of these is called Maersk, which is a Danish-based company, but they set up a U.S. division, registered in Delaware, I suspect. And as a result, they have ships that carry a U.S. flag, even though the actual revenue goes to a foreign company. The bottleneck in this process is not really the number of ships, because frankly, these ships are not being used in surge situations such as the recent wars in Iraq, but then the bottleneck to the process is the number of trained mariners who are available to deploy, to operate these U.S. military and DOT-owned ships, which then deploy in these emergencies. There's like 14 ships, I think, that are called the Ready Reserve Fleet, that are essentially mothballed. They sit in port. There's a skeleton crew on these ships, and then if they have to be deployed, then they bring in mariners from these U.S. flag ships. But it doesn't happen very often, and that is supposedly the motivation for these cargo preference rules. The recent estimates, and this is work that Vince and I did separately a couple of years ago, found that the costs of these cargo preference, because of these U.S. flag companies are able to charge higher rates for their freight, is costing between $40 and $50 million a year extra over what it would cost if it were just foreign flag ships. This cost has been entirely borne by the food aid programs themselves, since the requirements that Department of Transportation provide reimbursements were ended a couple of years ago. So now, essentially, we pay $40 to $50 million a year that goes to shipping companies, and the cost of that is essentially borne by people overseas who are not able to feed themselves. What do we recommend in this? Frankly, we think we should get rid of cargo preference for food aid to allow these scarce food aid resources to go further. The bulk of the profits go to the shipping companies and not really to the workers. And even though we talk about food aid cargo preference, it's not the only cargo preference rules that apply. In fact, it's only about 15% of all preference cargo that's carried on these ships. The remainder is military equipment, and then there also cargo preference is applied to equipment and materials that is purchased through loans and other kinds of arrangements through the Export-Import Bank and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. So it's food aid. Cargo preference does not apply just to food aid, but to other cargoes that are purchased by the U.S. government. We also think it would be a good idea to develop alternative means to ensure that there are trained mariners available that would be able to support deployment of these merchant marines. And the model that we look to is something like the National Guard system, which is that they agreed to be available, they agreed to do training, to keep up to date on the equipment, and then they receive a stipend for that training every year. And one reason why cargo preference is so inefficient is that they need to keep this large pool of mariners, because there is no protection, no legal protection given to them in their current civilian jobs. If they're deployed for military purposes, they may go back to their ship and find out they no longer have a job, which if they were in something like the National Guard, they would be provided some sort of protection on that. So that's the basics of cargo preference and why we think it's an inefficient process. I hand over to Chris.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to Vince and my old friend Arthur Brooks and the American Enterprise Institute for having me here and including me in your broader project on sensible reforms to U.S. agricultural policy. And thanks to Stephanie and to Aaron Lenz, who couldn't be with us. This is a fun project to work on together. So I'll pick up with the other two dimensions of current U.S. food aid policy that are seriously in need of reform. The first is the fact that we have very limited cash-based programming. By that I mean that right now, by design, the U.S. food aid programs involve in-kind shipments of commodities procured in and shipped from the United States. As Stephanie alluded to, This is a throwback to the old era of surplus disposal, when farm price support programs and loan guarantees meant that the US government wound up owning significant stockpiles of food, which we needed to get rid of someplace because it's costly to hold these stores. That's not how things work today. That's not how things have worked for roughly 20 years. So the move to cash-based programming, which all other donors have taken, excuse me, I hit the wrong button, is long overdue. Now, there is some good news here. In the 2014 Farm Bill, the revisions increased the ceiling on a very obscure provision called 202E, which gives USAID authority to use cash to support the programs that are fundamentally provided for using in-kind commodities. That cap used to be 13%, it went up to 20%. This gives NGOs, the World Food Program, the cash that they need to do the programming, to pay for transport, to pay for local staff, to pay for distribution, targeting, you name it. And it also enables them to reduce the use of monetization, which was discussed earlier. Monetization was introduced 30 some years ago precisely to generate cash resources for PVOs to be able to fund the distribution and delivery of food aid, so that the Congress didn't have to appropriate cash when it could just give additional surplus commodity that could be sold overseas. Since we don't have the surplus, selling commodities overseas is a way of turning a dollar bill into 50 cents. It's an extremely wasteful proposition. And the 202E increase enabled AID to rely much more on cash outlays to support food distribution than having to monetize. Indeed, there's only one remaining monetization program right now, a large-scale one in Bangladesh. The Farm Bill, however, set a minimum on monetization, a 15% minimum, which binds. AID runs that one monetization program in order to comply with US law. It's not at all clear that that's the best choice. There may be cases where monetization would work, but compelling it makes very little sense in today's era. So the core background on cash-based programming is the need to have some cash to complement food resources when food is the appropriate resource to use for disaster-affected populations in particular. In other words, when there's not enough food in the local market that you could just give them cash and they could easily get it through commercial distribution systems. So the evidence is that monetization is incredibly wasteful. USAID has actually become much better at this over the years. When they were doing open market monetization prior to the 2014 Farm Bill, they were getting something on the order of 70 to 75 cents on the dollar. USDA, which continues to monetize the overwhelming majority of the Food for Progress program, which is distinct from the Food for Peace program. Very confusing, same acronym, same basic idea, but different agencies, different design, different purpose, and most importantly, very different modalities. Food for Progress is a monetization program. Generate cash for the agencies that are running the programs on the ground. The most recent GAO estimates are that we lose something on the order of $70 million a year due to the waste intrinsic in food aid monetization. That's $70 million that is not going to feed people who desperately need assistance. Moreover, monetization, as Senator Corker mentioned, can be very destabilizing for commodity markets. We have some fairly hard evidence on this, that when you sell food aid, you're much more likely to be disrupting markets than when you're buying food aid in developing countries, which may seem slightly counterintuitive until you think through the geography of this, that you're only going to go buy in places that have relatively robust, deep markets, and what you're buying is a small share of the market, so you don't move the market price. While when you're distributing large volumes in places that right now are suffer a supply shortfall, you're much more likely to disrupt the market. So it's a pretty simple idea, but very important for investment in agricultural development in recipient countries. So the key takeaway on cash-based programming is there's been real progress. And the Congress would be wise to double down on its 2014 reforms by continuing or even increasing the ceiling on 202E cash, and also by eliminating the statutory minimum on monetization, the 15% minimum. So when there sometimes seems that this is a just completely nuts set of arrangements, it's important to recognize the progress that has been made over time and to celebrate the very real progress of the 2014 Farm Bill, with the expansion of the 202E ceiling. So we ask in this report that Congress consider increasing that further and reducing the monetization minimum. So the other big restriction, and frankly the most costly restriction in the entirety of US food aid programming, is the restriction on Title II and Food for Progress resources that you buy American exclusively. Now, let me caution that the opposite limiting case of you must distribute cash would be equally nuts. So constraining relief organizations to have to use exclusively commodities purchased in and shipped from the United States, or requiring that they only use cash transfers, are both inappropriate restrictions on an agency that desperately needs flexibility to meet the details of the local context. In some cases, food is actually quite valuable. So it's important, for example, in the recent Southern African drought situation, where markets are generally deficient, there's not enough food in the area, to supplement the supply, to bring in in-kind commodities. Or South Sudan, very similar situation, a difficult supply chain that makes food extremely expensive. If you push cash into the system, you're likely to just create inflation locally and hurt people, especially those who you fail to provide resources for. So in some places, in-kind delivery is a very good idea. The key point here is flexibility. Give the USAID administrator, give the Secretary of Agriculture the flexibility to use best practice suited to a given context. Now, we've already made some progress in this dimension. The 2002 Farm Bill introduced pre-positioning. So USAID pre-positions commodities for faster response. That's expensive, however, because you're paying for storage continuously in some remote location. It's also often difficult to get freight forwarders to take the cargoes from those facilities and move them to the destination. It's often harder to get somebody to show up at a facility in Djibouti than it is a facility in one of the Gulf ports that have much heavier traffic. So we see that the relaxations of some of the restrictions have taken forms that only add to the expense of the programs, like pre-positioning. The Congress funded a local and regional procurement pilot program in the 2008 Farm Bill, which was very carefully evaluated, both by a consortium of NGOs working with Cornell University, as well as by an independent evaluator. So two completely separate evaluations, each of which found the same takeaway. This reduces delays in delivery, which is crucial in an emergency, and it substantially reduces the costs of delivery. So we can save money and save time, and by the way, we can also maintain or even increase the food safety of the commodities distributed by using local and regional procurement. So the 2014 Farm Bill authorized the creation of a local and regional procurement program operated by USDA. There's now a placeholder, if you will, in the law for such a program, but there's been no direct appropriations for it. So it's merely a placeholder without actual money budgeted for it directly by the Congress. There's a small $5 million provision for LRP in USDA that's a separate thing. So we've made progress with pre-positioning with the local regional procurement authorization, but the program is still a Buy American, Ship American program that is incredibly wasteful. As a result, the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Relations Committees have authorized the use of international disaster assistance. So USAID's primarily now operating in emergencies using non-food aid resources, although they're providing food assistance. And they do this with cash, with vouchers, with local and regional procurement that come through an alternative appropriations process because the Farm Bill's restrictions impede the use of the core emergency food aid program to respond appropriately to emergencies. It's very curious, but things get creative in Washington, and there has been a creative solution. The EFSP, the Emergency Food Security Program, that was authorized in law under the 2016 Global Food Security Act, now winds up being the vehicle for more than $1 billion of food assistance internationally. That's the primary tool being used by USAID today to address humanitarian emergencies around the world. And the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust, which began many years ago as a wheat reserve in response to the cancellation of wheat sales contracts to Russia, then the Soviet Union. This is 1979 when President Carter embargoed the sale of wheat to the Soviet Union. As a result, the US government bought up the resulting wheat contracts, had a big wheat reserve, and it would gradually use these to supply wheat in emergencies. Well, that subsequently renamed the Emerson Trust, has been converted entirely to cash. Again, because cash is a more flexible instrument. You can use it to buy food or distribute cash as is most appropriate to the situation. So the key takeaway here is we need the right resource for any given emergency, that we can save time, we can save money if we relax the domestic procurement requirements to enable cash, voucher, LRP-based international food assistance. Cash and vouchers are almost always the fastest method, so when time is really of the essence, you commonly want to use those instruments to get a pipeline started. Transoceanic food aid shipments are the slowest and further delayed and rendered further expensive by cargo preference, as Stephanie already discussed. Pre-positioning is faster but more expensive by about $56 a ton. So the key takeaways here, oh, sorry, I forgot that we have a graphic here that's actually attributable to AEI. I encourage you to take a look at this in the report. It just helps to articulate, and I especially like the title that Vincent, his co-author on that report, gave it, Food Aid Folly. It just underscores the silliness, the common sense nature of the proposed reforms and the silliness of a domestic procurement requirement in responding to emergencies. The bottom line is we waste probably about $400 million. So we could feed an additional 4 to 10 million people easily off of the savings that exist. So the recommendations we make in the report are to reduce the 100% restriction on domestic procurement. And this isn't to say it should go to zero. It never would go to zero. USAID would always procure some commodity in the United States if given the flexibility. The point, again, is why restrict to either of the two extremes, all cash or all food shipped from the US? We find that the efficiency of the Canadian program as a comparison, which used to have a 90% buy Canadian restriction and let that go away, they're twice as efficient. Twice as much of every dollar they spend on international food assistance goes to the actual commodities received by hungry people. So that's what we could get to, but we're not there right now. So the key principle, pardon the typo in the last bullet point, the key principle is flexibility. And relaxing the domestic procurement requirement, relaxing the statutory minimum on monetization, relaxing the cargo preference requirements are all about building the flexibility needed to use increasingly scarce resources effectively in a world that faces more disasters, more problems faced by people who are struggling to feed their families than ever before. We need the flexibility, and only reforms of present food aid can accomplish that. So the core takeaway that I'd like to leave you with is the trade-offs intrinsic in this. If we're wasting, say, $400 million a year on these restrictions that necessarily generate inefficiencies, and saving lives in emergencies, especially very young children's lives, is actually pretty cheap. It's about $125 per child year in emergency response. Fairly careful studies in the public health literature can put a price on a child year saved, about $125. So $400 million actually goes a long way in saving child years. This translates into roughly 40,000 children who die a year. That's a very conservative back-of-the-envelope estimate. So 40,000 children's deaths per year that are entirely avoidable and that generate negligible gains in military readiness, maritime support, support for the US farm community. We're buying nothing for 40,000 children's lives a year. That's just very hard to defend. So the core takeaway of our message in this report is we need flexibility. The human cost of the programs is high. The economic cost of the programs is high. The rest of the world has adapted their approaches to international food assistance. It's time for the US government to do the same. The arguments against this are founded largely on myths that are now pretty widely discredited with very careful research by a wide range of people. It's time to shift the debate. So with that, let me...
Thanks, Chris. I can't help but make one moderator's comment. Let's just hope that the staffers on the House Agricultural Committee that are trying to set up roadblocks for change are listening. Brian, over to you. We look forward to your comments.
Right. Thank you, Vince. Thanks for the opportunity to have the possibility of contributing to this important dialogue on modernization of food assistance. I work with Save the Children. We're an 85-year-old organization, nonprofit organization. Of course, by our name, you know, we focus on children, and we want the world to change the way we treat children, and we want immediate and lasting change. We're in 120 countries. We've reached about, in 2016, about 157 million children, and we're a proud partner and implementer of Food for Peace, and have been for a very long time for both emergency and non-emergency programs. We're involved in the leadership of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. This is based on our own experience, and on the ground, we strongly support the need to pursue common sense reforms of the U.S. international food aid, and it'll benefit millions of vulnerable children and families around the world. We have been a long-time supporter of both food aid and food aid reform. We believe that reforming U.S. food aid is about making an excellent program even better by increasing its reach and its cost effectiveness. The inefficiencies of U.S. food aid stem, as we've heard quite clearly, from the restrictions of PL 480 Title II account that tie U.S. food assistance in almost entirely to American-grown agricultural commodities and strict cargo preference requirements. The inefficiencies of the policies are well documented. They're well documented in this paper. I'm going to make a few comments about this based on the perspective of someone who's been in the field for the better part of the last 20 years working on these programs. First, on cargo preference, there's a very strong call for elimination of cargo preferences. What struck me in the paper is the estimate of $50 million in additional cost that's borne by food aid programs because of cargo preferences every year, and that could translate to feeding 1.8 million more people. And having had to make very difficult decisions about the program scope and size when we're responding in a disaster, an emergency situation, and having to make decisions to reduce the scope, just thinking that we could feed 1.8 million people more every year, why don't we do that? A very similar case can be made for monetization. We've heard the inefficiencies of losing 20 to 25% on monetization, only getting 75 to 80% cost recovery when we monetize to fund the programs. We also note, as was talked about, that we had a little bit of a relief of the pressure in the 2014 Farm Bill by the increase of the percent of cash-based resources going from 7 to 20%. By increasing the cash resources available to fund the logistics of the in-country movement and food delivery, the pressure to use the inherently inefficient process of monetization is reduced. Again, same thing from the field perspective of having to make very difficult decisions on program scope and size and how many daily kilocalorie what percent of the daily kilocalorie requirements of women and children that we're going to provide with a relief program. We have to reduce that. We have to reduce the number of people that we serve. Why aren't we making sure that every single dollar goes further to reach more people? One thing that has not really been addressed, I believe, in the comments, although it is in the paper, is the discussion around the hard earmark or the safe box for non-emergency development food aid. The justification in the paper for this recommendation, the authors suggest that although most non-emergency food aid projects are beneficial, they typically have less impact in nutritional development and humanitarian terms than emergency food aid. Save the Children believes, on the contrary, that these non-emergency food aid projects have tremendous value. The programs principally are working to reduce the prevalence of chronic malnutrition in children or stunting in children. They help to build the resilience of vulnerable people to withstand future shocks, and that can ultimately reduce the number of people in need in future crises. I can give an example, a program that I was working with in Nicaragua. This would have been in the 2000s, where we were able to reduce the prevalence of stunting of children under 5 from 22% to less than 10%. That's almost 1 in 4 children that had permanently reduced capacity for their development before they turn 5, before they get into school. And by the end of the program, that prevalence was less than 10%, or 1 in 10 children. We do this, and we did this through a series of development activities, behavior change in nutrition, agricultural practices, better storage practices of basic grains, introduction of drought-resistant crops, et cetera. The interventions that are funded through these development food aid projects increase the resilience of these families. These families with healthier children and more diverse livelihoods are certainly less likely to require assistance when moderate shocks occur in the future. This means, again, less spending of emergency funds when future crises happen. With regards to the sourcing of food aid, the recommendation is to end requirements that food aid be sourced in the U.S., and we agree. Save the Children supports increased flexibility and availability, and as Chris has pointed out, of basically having, we describe this as having all of the tools in the toolbox, whether it's the use of commodities, which are perfectly appropriate and necessary in many instances. Commodities still play a critical role and should play a critical role in U.S. food aid. In many contexts, local markets, in many circumstances, market-based solutions, we call them market-based solutions, such as cash and vouchers, provide a quicker means of ensuring that food reaches families, and we've found that local markets, surprisingly and remarkably, even in difficult circumstances, respond very well to these programs. In addition to this, the increased flexibility of Title II resources to provide market-based solutions can provide other added benefits related to functionality of local markets and potentially increasing the resilience of beneficiaries to future shocks. Increasing the use of market-based assistance in U.S. food aid to address humanitarian needs can create new opportunities to expand to financial services to the poor. The expansion of mobile money and other digital products can be transformational in the lives of the poor by expanding platforms through which financial services can be delivered to the unbanked. Increasing access to financial services has long been identified as a key pathway out of poverty by helping people to expand their options, better manage their risks, and create safety nets. Chris mentioned an example of Southern Africa in recent years. Before coming here, I was in Zimbabwe and was pleased to be involved in a very interesting program. In 2014, there was a drought, as often happens. Zimbabwe is a low-income, food deficit country, often suffers from food shortages. The 2014 season, there was about a 51% reduction in the production of the main staple crop, which is maize. And that left millions of Zimbabweans in a serious situation of food insecurity. So Save the Children responded with support from Food for Peace. Now, this would have been the Emergency Food Security Program, which is funded by the IDA account, to provide conditional mobile cash transfers to the affected population. We worked with a local mobile network operator to set up accounts for beneficiaries and provide coverage. And they expanded their cell phone coverage tremendously in the impacted area. Local traders with no additional incentives from the program were very quick to respond to make sure that goods were available in the market. And so this is in an area where there are chronic food shortages, but local markets responded well. In the end of this program, we had tens of thousands of people who made it through that next lean season. They were able to survive. But in addition to that, we also had a permanently expanded mobile network coverage. We had strengthened market linkages and trade linkages. We had thousands of families who had this SIM card, and I have pictures of dozens of these old grandmothers, Zimbabwean grandmothers with their phone that they provided for the program and their SIM card and smiling. These SIM cards were still active after the program, and many of these families have migrated relatives that have gone down to South Africa for employment or to Harare, to the capital, and they were receiving remittances. So in the following lean season, they had the option of receiving remittances from their family members. This increases their resilience. This is increasing the possibility that of the need, when the next crisis happens, of the need for emergency food aid in that area. So these kind of experiences on the ground have demonstrated to us that greater flexibility in the sourcing of U.S. food aid will allow us to deliver food aid more quickly and more efficiently, and that other benefits exist that could potentially reduce the amount of resources needed for future responses. Therefore, we wholeheartedly agree with the observation of the authors that state that the ending the requirements of food aid being sourced in the U.S. is perhaps the single most effective change that could be made to current U.S. food assistance policies. That's all I have to say. Over to you, Vince.
I never have anything to say. Just to... Sorry. Mocking laughter from my colleague here. Just a single anecdote, there are places where if we ship from the US, we are spending $400 per ton. We could knock that down to $100 a ton with local and regional sourcing. And those $300 back of the envelope saves 6 children's lives on just 1 ton of food aid. It's stunningly worrying that the U.S. House Agriculture Committee wishes to stand in the way of these sorts of changes for little benefit, in fact, zero benefit for the constituencies they represent. Again, not that I have an opinion. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the floor. So if you have burning or other questions, feel free to ask. So the lady here.
Once again, thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question from a broader perspective. One of the things I'm seeing in terms of the recommendations is that clearly they're focused on U.S. Policy change. But I'm also interested in the implications of these recommendations if you take a food system perspective. So that by moving the production of agriculture into the countries, there are actually potential for public-private partnerships, for transnational corporations to be involved with food production, which by a systems analysis shows it has implications for companies that are actually housed in the U.S. So I'd like to get a sense of your perspective from a food system analysis as to the implications of these recommendations.
Yeah. So my sense is that that country is better off if we help them become better at producing food. There are benefits to that country, and I think there are benefits internationally. So to the extent that we can graduate these countries from relying on emergency food aid, and we can provide them assistance, as Brian talked about, to become more resilient, more capable of producing their own food, there are a range of benefits to the sector, to that broader economy, because so many developing countries are largely dependent on agriculture as being big parts of their economy. And then I also tend to think, and I think that Senator Corker references, that a country that is food secure tends to be more politically stable. So there are benefits internationally from those kinds of developments. There are multinational companies that are starting to invest, food companies that are starting to invest in sub-Saharan Africa, but some of the things that they're lacking are infrastructure, a set of regulations that they're comfortable with, and there's a range of improvements that need to be made in the whole system to make that work. And there is stuff being done within the Feed the Future initiative that I also work on that is helping in that area. But for the purposes of this paper, we're focusing on food aid and how can we improve how those programs operate.
If I can maybe just describe one example. There's a program in Zambia, in the Luangwa Valley, known as Kamako, which is a joint NGO venture conservation as well as humanitarian assistance and development assistance. And part of the innovation of Kamako is in helping farmers to adopt more conservation-friendly practices, agroforestry, better management of soils, et cetera, and value addition post-harvest. So for ground nuts, they've developed processing facilities. They have a commercial brand of peanut butter. It's wild peanut butter, look it up, that is sold through retail distributors in Southern Africa. And one of their other products is micronutrient-enriched peanut butter, so a therapeutic food for helping children in disasters. Right now, the US government, under Title II, cannot purchase that product from It's Wild. They can't buy a micronutrient-enhanced therapeutic feeding commodity from an indigenous processor, helped, by the way, by an American multinational. General Mills donated the extruders and trained them on how to have good food safety practices and groundnut peanut processing practices. That's a great example of a nonprofit, for-profit partnership generating a valuable commercial product that helps local farmers, helps keep them out of the park and poaching, by the way. That's demonstrated pretty conclusively by a team of researchers. This is win-win. The food systems effects in terms of conservation of the underlying agroecology, advancing the non-farm incomes of local farming families, as well as more timely, cost-effective delivery of very high-quality foods to kids in desperate need. Everybody wins here, other than a very small group of constituents here who lose the windfall profits.
You're talking about the 3 shipping companies.
Yeah. And actually, if I may just briefly reply to Brian on the safe box hard earmark. I don't think we actually disagree, other than perhaps one point. The issue around the hard earmark is, again, flexibility. So you argue, and I absolutely agree with you, and I'm sure Stephanie and Aaron do as well, that development food assistance is very high return. I couldn't agree with you more. I've devoted much of my research career to working on agricultural and rural development. The issue is, do you give the USAID administrator the flexibility to decide what's the best investment at the moment for my limited budget? This is essentially an argument around why has the inflation-adjusted budget for food assistance declined by 76% since the 1960s? The budget constraint binds so tightly that we forego very high return investments in longer-term development projects that could be effectively supported with food assistance. But to fund those, to constrain the ID administrator to have to rely have to fund those and give up emergency response and have children die as a result, that's not very good development strategy. So it's just an argument over flexibility and the scale of the resources available for humanitarian and development assistance.
Jerry Hagstrom. I know Jerry, so I can call him out by name.
Yes, I write the Hagstrom Report. I'm a columnist at National Journal. Would you place any restrictions on using this money to buy food from countries such as Brazil, Thailand, Turkey, countries that the United States has complained are increasing their agricultural subsidies in competition with American farmers? And
Jerry,
the European Union too.
Yeah, the language for the pilot that Chris talked about in the 08 Farm Bill restricted LRP purchases to developing countries, so that it was it couldn't be sourced from other exporters. And I think the way EFSP operates, although I don't think there's a statutory restriction, that they also purchase only from developing countries and not from those that are commercial exporters. So those kinds of restrictions are already in place.
And what about this report? What does it say anything about that?
We don't say anything about this expressly in the report. My own hypothesis is that would be a non-binding constraint. I have no objection to such a constraint at all. In practice, when you see World Food Program and PVOs buying food in developing countries or not facing a restriction that you have to buy in the donor country, we don't see them buying from China, buying from Brazil. That occurs with Brazilian and Chinese donations. It's not occurring with European-funded donations to PVOs. it's almost always most cost effective to be buying close to where you're going to distribute. So it would be a non-binding restriction. I have no objection whatsoever to the restriction. It's just it's unlikely that it would make any difference in practice.
Yes, ma'am. At the front.
Oh, careful.
Thank you. My name is Jessica Trisco-Darden. I'm a professor at American University and Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow here at AEI. And I want to talk market distortions because Senator Corker made this comment about food aid dumping. We got a lot of murmurs of agreement, but actually my read of the academic literature suggests that the idea that food aid causes local market distortions, it's still an open question. So unless there's some meta-analyses that you're aware of that I haven't read, I think that would be worth mentioning. But I also want to talk about local and regional procurement and what potential effects this has on local markets, because that's not in the report, obviously, it's outside scope, but I think it is of concern to some of the people in this room as well, whether the scale on which local and regional procurement is currently done versus the scale on which it would be done if some of these restrictions you're proposing be loosened are in fact loosened, what sorts of impacts we would expect that to have on local markets.
The in-kind, the Title II and the other programs, there's a requirement that a PVO that's engaging in a project in a country has to evaluate the impact on that local market of the kinds of commodities it wants to bring to the United States. It's called a Bellman analysis. My sense is there's quite a wide range of quality of those analyses, so that they're supposed to make a determination as to whether or not a particular commodity would be harmful, and then if it is, then choose another one. I'm not sure it always achieves that aim, but that is actually in the law that kind of analysis is supposed to be done. I would not be averse to requiring a similar kind of analysis for an expansion of LRP. I don't know that there is a requirement right now for that, but it wouldn't be a bad idea.
You're absolutely right. The literature is not conclusive, although I would argue that the preponderance of the findings on food aid distribution's effects on markets are common sense. If you dump a very large volume in a country relative to its market, you're likely to have an effect on prices. Or if you sell at a discount on a market just to get cash quickly, you're likely to have a disruptive effect. And there are multiple studies that show that, while there are multiple studies that likewise find absolutely no price effects whatsoever of sale. Much of it just depends upon sensible practice. Similarly, purchase in developing countries. I mentioned the evaluation of the local and regional procurement pilot program authorized in the 2008 Farm Bill, and these two large-scale evaluations done both found that there was no market effect, no discernible market price effect, either in terms of level or volatility of prices from procurement. You raise a very fair question. That was a pilot program. It wasn't a large-scale program. So we can't be certain what happens out of sample, if you will, if you scale this up considerably. That said, essentially the argument one is making is, what if there's bad operational practice? You know, if one goes into a market and buys a crazy amount relative to that market size, won't you have an adverse effect? Well, of course. Just like if you dump a large volume in a market that can't absorb it, you'll have an adverse effect. And this is the justification for the Bellman analysis Stephanie talks about. The point isn't that you can't do damage with bad practice. The point is that you should allow flexibility in practice and hold those who are making the decisions accountable, both for doing the prior analysis as well as for following up to make sure that indeed there aren't unintended harms caused by either the purchase or the distribution of food.
Before the Section 202E number went up to 20%, there were cases where national governments actually asked USDA or USAID to not allow monetization of a specific product in their country because they felt it was having adverse effect. So there are documented cases of that occurring. So we know that has happened, and that was part of the motivation, I think, for the Ag committees to raise that 202E to reduce the requirement of monetization in Title II.
Of course, a similar argument can be made when you're injecting cash with the cash-based programs. Are you causing inflation? So, you need to have the flexibility to be able to monitor that, and we do that with these programs with the post-distribution monitoring. You're looking at all of the prices of all of the commodities that are being purchased by this cash. Is inflation setting in? And you have to monitor the markets after every distribution, and that's part of, it's responsible programming that needs to be done by field practitioners in any case.
Yeah, and AID has put those rules in place.
Isn't it true also that you've got to be careful about the likely scope of these effects in the context of increased flexibility? We're not talking about the whole. My understanding is, and you please tell me if I'm right or wrong, my understanding is that we're not talking about the whole emergency food aid budget being allocated for local and regional sourcing. So the scope is not as great as the total budget. Is that true?
Correct. There's no scenario under which USAID would use the entirety of its resources available for international food assistance to buy locally or regionally.
Yeah.
You will always have a significant share sourced from the United States. The United States is an extraordinarily productive agricultural economy, and especially for more processed commodities, for distribution of commodities to destinations closer to the United States where the delays and the shipping costs are much lower, it will quite commonly be more cost effective and at least as fast to deliver from the United States. And the USAID would always do that. It's just that we don't want to be always bound to do that because in many situations it is slow and wasteful.
Well, on that note, it's time to draw the session to a conclusion. I want to really thank the panel, Stephanie, Chris, Brian. I've actually learned a lot today, mainly from Brian, I might add. But I really appreciate you all. I think we all do. And let's thank our panel as usual.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yep, you're off.
Yes.